There are legends that rise slowly, sculpted over years of discipline, ambition, and strategic brilliance. And then there are legends like Veronica Lake, born not from planning, not from power, but from an accident of beauty so haunting it changed the very silhouette of a decade. Before anyone knew her name, the world knew her shadow. That mysterious curtain of hair sliding over one eye, a gesture that turned into a national obsession, and a symbol of seduction so dangerous that even the U.S. government eventually had to step in. But behind that iconic image, behind the cool gaze, the aloof smile, the Ice Queen aura, lived a woman carrying far more darkness than the cameras ever revealed. Veronica did not simply play the femme fatale. Life cast her into that role long before Hollywood ever called. She came from a childhood cracked by loss, grew into a young woman who felt displaced in every room she entered, and reached the peak of fame at a speed no heart could sustain. Stardom embraced her violently and let go just as fast. What the world saw was glamour. What she lived was loneliness. What fans adored was mystery. What she carried was grief. What Hollywood celebrated was the icon. What it abandoned was the woman. Her rise was dazzling, almost unreal. Her fall, brutal, public, and merciless, reads like a noir script she never auditioned for. And yet, even when everything else faded, even when the lights dimmed and the roles disappeared, the myth of Veronica Lake refused to die. Because some legends burn bright, but others, like hers, burn beautifully and then shatter. This is the story of the woman behind the shadow, the star Hollywood could not save, and the mystery it could never forget. Before Veronica Lake became the woman whose silhouette could be recognized from a single curl of hair, she was Constance, a quiet, watchful girl growing up in a world that never quite felt steady beneath her feet. Born in Brooklyn and raised between shifting addresses and uncertain routines, she learned early that security could vanish without warning. When her father died unexpectedly when she was 12, the shock carved a silent wound inside her. Her mother remarried swiftly, building a new household, but Constance carried the sense that she had been quietly left behind. That loneliness would later become the cool, enigmatic aura that made Veronica Lake irresistible on screen. She did not dream of fame. Hollywood was not a destiny she chased, but a horizon she drifted toward, almost by accident. Acting, to her, wasn't ambition, it was escape. An escape from the girl who felt invisible, from the soft ache of childhood grief, from a life where she never quite fit. She was still a teenager when she boarded a train west, armed with little more than a strange beauty and a guarded heart. Directors initially dismissed her as another pretty face. Producers assumed she lacked confidence. She didn't argue, she simply waited. Veronica was quiet, but she wasn't weak. She was studying the game long before the game noticed her. Her break came through a twist of fate so small it felt like a cosmic joke. In the 1941 film I Wanted Wings, she appeared only briefly, her role insignificant. But in one scene, her long blonde hair fell across one eye. Not deliberately, not styled, but by pure accident. The camera caught it, the light embraced it, and the image became electric. Audiences were hypnotized. Columnists wrote about the girl with the hidden eye. Hollywood, always hungry for something new, suddenly wanted only her. Overnight, Constance disappeared, replaced by Veronica Lake, a name that sounded like something carved from moonlight. Her peekaboo hairstyle became a national fascination. Women across America tried to imitate it. Beauticians were asked to recreate it daily. Ads featured it. Newspapers couldn't stop talking about it. Veronica didn't just become famous, she became a cultural event. For a girl who had spent her early life feeling unseen, the irony was bittersweet. The world was finally looking at her, Yet it was looking only at a hairstyle, a shadow over an eye, a piece of her rather than the whole. But in those early years, Veronica had a magnetism that didn't depend solely on beauty. She possessed a natural detachment, a coolness that made her seem both close and unreachable. Directors called it mystery. Co-stars called it aloofness. But it was something far simpler, a woman still learning how to protect herself. Hollywood mistook her guardedness for attitude, her insecurity for arrogance, her silence for defiance. She was stepping into fame with the heart of a girl still grieving, still watching the world from behind glass. Yet despite her inner uncertainty, the spotlight adored her. Films came quickly, publicity campaigns exploded. She was labeled the Noir goddess before she even understood what that meant. Veronica was no longer drifting, she was rising, pulled upward by an image that felt both powerful and frightening. She had entered Hollywood seeking freedom, but she found instead a spotlight that blinded as much as it illuminated. In this first ascent, dazzling, swift, and intoxicating, the seeds of her downfall were already woven in. Because her fame was built not on who she was, but on a shadow that fate had placed over her eye. And in Hollywood, when the image becomes larger than the woman, the fall is never far behind. By the early 1940s, Hollywood had crowned countless beauties, but none of them sparked a cultural tremor the way Veronica Lake did. Her rise was sudden, almost violent in its intensity, driven not by a blockbuster performance or a meticulously crafted publicity campaign, but by a single, accidental fall of hair that reshaped the silhouette of American womanhood. The peekaboo look wasn't just a trend, it was a sensation, a visual phenomenon that radiated from movie screens into factories, offices, and homes across the country. Women didn't simply admire Veronica, they wanted to be her, and in copying her, they unknowingly turned her into an icon of a generation defined by war, longing, and a hunger for glamour amid uncertainty. Everywhere she went, Veronica watched her reflection multiply in the crowds. Strangers passing by with one eye slightly softened under a veil of blonde, brunettes attempting the same mysterious drape, young girls practicing it in mirrors, hoping to capture even a fraction of her spell. Hairstylists reported lines out the door. Magazines published tutorials titled "How to Achieve the Veronica Look." The image spread so fast that it no longer belonged to the actress who inspired it. It belonged to America. And then, something unexpected happened. Something no Hollywood star had faced before. As the United States plunged deeper into World War II, millions of women joined the workforce, taking jobs in factories, shipyards, and assembly lines. The country needed them, and they needed to look the part of strong, capable workers. But many of them insisted on holding on to Veronica's glamorous peekaboo hairstyle, even while operating dangerous machinery. It didn't take long for reports to surface. Hair caught in drill presses, hair pulled into conveyor belts, hair wrapped around spinning tools. Injuries mounted. Supervisors complained. Factories worried. America was fighting a war, and Veronica's hair, impossibly, had become a national problem. Government officials didn't see glamour, they saw hazard. So, one afternoon, in a press event that felt more surreal than dramatic, Veronica Lake was asked, urged, to change her signature look. She was photographed pinning her hair up, demonstrating a safer wartime style. Newsreels showed her urging women to prioritize safety over beauty. It was the strangest kind of patriotic act, a Hollywood star sacrificing her own mystique for the sake of factory workers she'd never met. The announcement made headlines. Some praised her, some mocked the situation entirely. But for Veronica, the moment revealed a truth she hadn't yet understood. She was no longer a person to the public. She was a symbol, a silhouette, an idea that others could borrow, reshape, or dismantle for their own purposes. And with that realization came a subtle shift inside her. Fame, which had once felt flattering, began to taste metallic, almost cold. She had been elevated so quickly that she barely knew how to hold herself up, and now the very image that lifted her to stardom was being taken from her, polished into something palatable for wartime America. Still, the studios pressed forward. Paramount saw Veronica's reach as a goldmine. They placed her in film after film, sultry noirs, shadow-drenched dramas, sophisticated thrillers, roles that exaggerated the allure audiences believed she possessed. On screen, she was untouchable, mysterious, the woman you could want but never truly know. Off-screen, she was shrinking, feeling the weight of a persona that didn't fit her skin. America wanted the illusion. Hollywood wanted the money. And Veronica Lake, caught between both, realized that the hairstyle which had catapulted her into history had also become the cage that would one day trap her. Because in Hollywood, nothing is more dangerous than a myth that grows bigger than the woman who inspired it. When Veronica Lake stepped into the shadows of film noir, something uncanny happened. The genre seemed to recognize her as one of its own. She didn't need to learn how to move like a femme fatale. She simply was one, long before Hollywood realized it. Her cool detachment, her unblinking gaze, the way she seemed to glide instead of walk, it all felt like an extension of the mystery that had trailed her since childhood. And when Paramount paired her with Alan Ladd, the chemistry was explosive in a way that could never be planned. Ladd, only a few inches taller than Veronica, was often framed standing on platforms or boxes, but none of that mattered on screen. Together, they created a magnetic contradiction. He was stoic, wounded, quietly dangerous. She was cold fire, elegant, enigmatic, almost unreachable. In this Gun for Hire, The Glass Key, and The Blue Dahlia, their eyes did the acting long before their lines did. Audiences were hypnotized. Critics called her the icy angel of noir. Directors called her the most photogenic enigma ever captured on film. But success carried a shadow, and Veronica carried shadows better than most. Behind the camera, her reputation began to shift. Co-stars whispered that she was difficult. Directors complained about her lateness, her indifference, her refusal to play by the unspoken rules of studio etiquette. Veronica wasn't arrogant. She was detached, floating through a world she didn't entirely believe in. That aloofness, however, was misread as attitude. And in an era when actresses were expected to charm both audiences and executives, Veronica didn't even try. The truth was more painful than the rumors. She was fighting battles no one could see. Her marriage to director John Detley had already begun to crumble under the weight of fame and emotional distance, and she was carrying the heavy burden of trying to balance stardom with vulnerability she never knew how to express. When she later married the intense, complicated filmmaker Andre de Toth, she hoped for stability, maybe even sanctuary. But life dealt her one of its cruelest blows. Their baby daughter was born prematurely and died shortly after birth. The loss carved a scar deep inside Veronica that would never truly close. She tried to return to work, burying herself in scripts and film sets, but nothing felt the same. On screen, her eyes seemed harder, colder. Critics called it noir perfection, never realizing it was grief. Friends noticed she drank more heavily. Co-stars whispered that she seemed distant, unreachable. The woman who once controlled the spotlight with a tilt of her head was now shrinking behind it, hiding a pain too intimate for Hollywood's bright lights. The studio machine kept turning. Paramount demanded professionalism, glamour, smiles for the camera. Veronica complied on the surface, but something in her was splintering. She moved through sets like a ghost, delivering flawless performances while feeling increasingly hollow inside. Alcohol became her shield, a way to mute the noise, to blur the expectations, to survive the ache of losing a child in a world that expected her to be unbreakable. What made Veronica perfect for Noir wasn't the hairstyle or the lighting or the roles she played. It was the truth that lived behind her eyes. The truth of someone who understood that beauty can be a trap, fame can be a prison, and grief can be the shadow that never leaves. Hollywood saw the surface and believed it understood her, but Veronica Lake was not an image. She was a wound dressed in silk, a heart wrapped in mystery, a woman whose darkness didn't need to be acted because it was already there. The early 1940s had belonged entirely to Veronica Lake, but fame, especially the kind that arrives violently and without warning, rarely grants mercy. By the time she reached her early 30s, the cracks that had long been forming beneath the polished surface finally began to split open. What started as whispers on studio lots soon grew into open complaints. She was difficult, she was unpredictable, she was unreliable. To the public, she remained the cool, luminous goddess of noir, but to Hollywood executives, she was becoming a liability. Her lateness on set became legendary. Sometimes she arrived hours behind schedule, drifting in with an air of indifference that infuriated directors but captivated the press. Sometimes she simply didn't show up. The reason wasn't arrogance, it was exhaustion, depression, and the increasingly heavy dependence on alcohol that clouded her judgment and stole her discipline. Hollywood, however, was not interested in nuance. It had a short memory for vulnerability and a long one for inconvenience. Rumors spread that she alienated co-stars, that she ignored instructions, that she seemed bored by the very films that had made her a star. And though some of it was exaggerated, enough of it was true for Paramount to take notice. Studios in those days were empires, and actors were expected to behave like loyal subjects. Veronica, even unintentionally, broke that unspoken contract. The final blow came quietly. Paramount reviewed her declining box office numbers, weighed them against her growing unpredictability, and decided she was no longer worth the trouble. They allowed her contract to expire, a soft dismissal wrapped in polite language. One day, she was one of the most photographed women in America, and the next, she was a free agent with fewer offers than she cared to admit. Hollywood didn't fire Veronica Lake. It simply let her fade. Roles disappeared. Scripts stopped arriving. Meetings were canceled. The phone rang less each week. And in an industry fueled by momentum, stillness is the beginning of the end. Veronica tried to hide the fear, but it seeped through everything. Through her voice, through her relationships, through her increasingly erratic behavior. Alcohol became her closest companion. What had once been a coping mechanism now became a necessity, blurring her nights and unraveling her days. Friends watched her drift, trying to reach for her, but finding only the fog she wrapped around herself. Her marriage to Andre de Toth collapsed under the weight of grief, frustration, and addiction, leaving Veronica lonelier than she had ever been. As her personal life crumbled, her public image began to distort. The press, once enchanted by her icy beauty, now swarmed around her missteps. Photographs captured her looking tired, disoriented, older than her years. Headlines shifted from admiration to mockery. Hollywood loves a fall, especially when it comes from someone who once stood too far above the rest. The Veronica Lake who had once embodied mystery and glamour was now becoming a cautionary tale. She moved from apartment to apartment, losing stability, losing friends, losing the version of herself she had once barely understood. Her finances suffered, her spirit dimmed, And the industry that had crowned her queen now pretended not to recognize her at all. She tried to anchor herself in small projects, low-budget films, and stage plays, but none of them restored what had been lost. The cameras no longer adored her. The spotlight no longer sought her. Hollywood had turned the page, and Veronica was left standing in the margins, watching the industry she once dominated move on without her. This was the beginning of her true descent, a slow, painful unraveling, not caused by scandal or wrongdoing, but by heartbreak, grief, and the unforgiving machinery of fame. And once the unraveling began, nothing would stop the fall that waited just below. By the mid-1950s, the woman who once defined Hollywood glamour was living a life so far removed from fame that it felt like a cruel joke crafted by destiny. Veronica Lake, the star whose hair had captivated a nation, was now barely holding herself together. The roles were gone. The money was gone. Even the allure that once seemed untouchable began to fade under the weight of sleepless nights, cheap motels, and bottles that never stayed full for long. New York became her refuge and her prison. She drifted through its streets unnoticed, her once legendary face now hidden beneath scarves, sunglasses, and the exhaustion of a life lived in free fall. She found work where she could, waitressing, bartending, serving cocktails to customers who had no idea the woman placing drinks on their table had once been a goddess of the silver screen. Some recognized her, a flicker of familiarity, a whispered, "Is that?" But most did not. And perhaps, on her darker days, Veronica preferred it that way. Alcohol was relentless. It smothered her anxieties, numbed her memories, and blurred the edges of a world that no longer had a place for her. Police records show multiple arrests, public intoxication, disorderly conduct, unpaid bills. Each incident chipped away at what remained of her myth. The newspapers mocked her downfall with cruel delight, reducing her struggles to punchlines. Hollywood, always hungry for the next tragedy, had turned her into one. Yet beneath the wreckage, Veronica still fought. In 1969, she published her autobiography, Veronica, the Autobiography of Veronica Lake, an unfiltered confession that startled readers with its honesty. She spoke of the pressures of fame, the loneliness behind the camera, the death of her daughter, her battles with addiction, and the cruelty of an industry that discards women the moment they lose their shine. For a brief moment, people listened again. Bookstores sold out. Talk shows invited her. But the resurgence was fleeting. Once the curiosity faded, so did the attention. Determined to reclaim some part of herself, Veronica attempted a small comeback. She accepted minor stage roles, acted in low-budget films, even ventured into television. But the audiences who once adored her now found her unrecognizable, and the studios that once chased her barely remembered her name. Time had washed away the mythology, leaving only a woman who still carried the grace of her youth, but none of its protection. Her health deteriorated quickly. Years of heavy drinking had ravaged her liver and kidneys. She suffered from pancreatitis, hepatitis, and chronic pain. By the early 1970s, she was living in a cheap motel in Burlington, Vermont, a room with thin walls, dim lighting, and a silence broken only by the sound of her own coughing. She rarely saw friends. She barely saw doctors. She was simply fading. In July 1973, Veronica Lake died at the age of 50, her body overwhelmed by acute hepatitis and renal failure. There was no glamorous final scene, no Hollywood farewell, no studio tribute. Her death was quiet, almost anonymous, a whisper instead of a headline. And then came the final twist, the last tragic flourish in a life shaped by shadows. Her ashes disappeared. Misplaced, forgotten, shuffled between funeral homes and storage rooms, they remained lost for years. A star who once belonged to the whole world now belonged to no one, drifting through limbo even after death. It is a haunting image, a woman who became iconographic through her silhouette, leaving behind nothing but missing ashes. But perhaps in a strange, poetic way, it fit her story. Veronica Lake had always been a mystery, and mysteries, especially the noir kind, never die cleanly. They linger, they fade, they haunt. In the end, Veronica Lake became what Hollywood never knew how to hold, a legend carved from light and absence, a woman remembered not for her triumphs alone, but for the shadows that shaped her. She arrived like a whisper, rose like a storm, and vanished like smoke, leaving behind an image so powerful that it outlived the fragile heart that carried it. The world adored her silhouette, that curtain of hair falling over one eye, but few ever asked what it hid. Behind that glamorous veil was a woman who loved deeply, hurt quietly, and fought battles she never had the tools to win. Hollywood dazzles, but it also devours. Veronica's beauty made her untouchable, but it also imprisoned her. Her mystery made her iconic, but it also isolated her. And the machine that lifted her into the heavens had no hesitation in letting her fall when she no longer fit the part it wanted her to play. It is an old story in this town, yet somehow, in her case, unbearably personal. But legends do not survive because of perfection. They survive because of contradictions, fractures, the human truths that echo long after the applause fades. Veronica Lake became immortal not simply because she was beautiful, but because she embodied the fragile line between desire and despair, brilliance and collapse, control and surrender. Her life was a noir film written across 3 decades, luminous at the start, shadowed in the middle, devastating in the final act. And so she remains the goddess of the half-lit frame, the star whose ashes went missing, the woman who slipped through Hollywood's fingers like a dream no one could hold on to. Veronica Lake may have left the world quietly, but her myth never did. Some lights dim, hers flickers forever.